All right. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the 2013 Media Commons Tailgate. I really appreciate you guys all taking the trek out here on this fine Friday morning. Not Saturday. It used to be Saturday. Now it's Friday. To join us, my name is Chris Millay. I'm the Interim Director of Education and Technology Services. And I usually like to start these sorts of events out trying to get to know the attendees a little bit. So I'm just out of curiosity, how many of you guys are coming from one of the Commonwealth campuses? Good, so about half of you, awesome. The Tailgate actually started back when we were called Digital Commons in 2008, and I'm just curious, this is actually in the Schuylkill campus, which Vince is back there, he helped us set that up. How many of you guys have been to at least one other Tailgate? How about 2? 3? About 4. Nice, so there's like 3 or 4 of you guys. That's awesome. I really appreciate you coming out again. I was just actually out at Abington campus. Anybody from Abington here? Absolutely beautiful campus. Just kind of touring around and looking at their learning spaces, and it was really a great opportunity. I think that the program team here for the Tailgate this year put together a really great program. I hope you took a look at it, kind of planned out your day. There's a lot of really great sessions. I'm actually not sure which ones I want to go to yet, but really looking forward to the rest of the day and having some conversations with you guys. In kind of preparing for this opening remarks, I was thinking about the branching out theme today, and thinking about what that means to me in terms of branching out, in terms of my own work and all of your work. And one of the ways I was thinking about that idea of branching out was in terms of the new technologies, obviously, that we're branching out into and exploring every day. And I thought I'd do a quick kind of survey of some of the technologies that ETS is looking at right now, and probably a lot of you are looking into as well. I couldn't do an educational technology presentation without saying MOOC at least once, so this is my obligatory MOOC slide. If you're not aware, I'm sure you are, Penn State has a partnership with Coursera right now. We're running 5 MOOCs. We have 2 that have completed and 1 that's in progress right now. And the total enrollment for all these MOOCs is over 310,000. So these things are huge. And I think that there's some presentations about some of the MOOCs that we've run today. Bart Purcell's here, who's doing a lot of research around these things. So if you're kind of curious about what the outcomes of these things are, what the student experiences are like, then definitely talk to some of those folks about that. But a lot of really interesting stuff going in here. Not sure if this is going to be the kind of end-all be-all of online learning technology per se, but we're definitely learning a lot, and it's a pretty exciting time in that area. Another thing that we're focusing on is learning analytics. Anybody that knows me knows I talk about learning analytics ad nauseum sometimes. Learning analytics is essentially using big data to understand student behaviors, predict student success, and then customize interventions to help students who are having problems get some personalized help with their problems. So a lot of cool stuff going on there. We have some research projects going on and working with some different vendors in that space. Digital badges, another really exciting area for us. Is Chris Stubbs here? If you see Chris Stubbs later today, he's in charge of the Educational Gaming Commons and is working on a digital badges platform for Penn State. So this is a homegrown system that interfaces with Mozilla Open Badges and really gets at this idea of competency-based learning at Penn State. So this is really going to offer us a lot of interesting opportunities in the way that we deliver educational opportunities to our students. So cool stuff there. I'm sure that he'd be happy to give you a little demo of that system. Ben Brodigam is going to be showing off some of the work that we're doing in the mobile space. Lots of exciting things going here. I mean, there's been a lot of exciting things happening in mobile for a number of years, but I think it's getting to the point where it's a lot more accessible for people. And between the mobile media pilots, which we'll talk about later, and some of the work that Ben's doing with sociology and some ways of engaging students in the classroom with a global audience, again, really exciting stuff. Kind of more along the futuristic side of things that we're just starting to get our hands on that are, we're not really sure what we're going to do with yet, but we're just sort of learning at this point. One of those things is 3D printing. And this is another, in our demo room, we have a 3D printer actually set up so you can check out what these things are like. And this is like stuff that's straight out of science fiction. I'm a nerd, so this is my obligatory Star Trek photo. But this is really like the replicator, right? In fact, the 3D printer that we actually have in the demo room is actually called the Replicator 3. So they definitely take a nod to science fiction, but it really is science fiction. When you see these things work, when you see, with the ease of a laser printer, a 3D object materializing in front of your eyes, it's actually really slow, so it doesn't really materialize. It takes about 7 hours to make a cup instead of like 2 seconds. But it's getting there. It's a glimpse at the future. Gesture interfaces, this is another thing that we have actually in the demo room with a little technology called Leap Motion, which is an amazing little tiny box. It costs $80. And it allows you to basically turn your entire desktop, the area of space in front of your body, into a gesture interface where you can move your hands and control your computer and do all kinds of great stuff. And again, a little nod from science fiction. This was in a movie, Minority Report, with Tom Cruise, I don't know, like 10 years ago. That stuff that he did in that movie is completely available in the consumer market today. So this stuff is probably ahead of the curve in terms of what science fiction predicted. Augmented reality is another space that we're playing in, and I think that Nick Smirker and some of the folks in the libraries are going to talk about some things that they're doing with augmented reality in the libraries. And you've probably all seen Google Glass, so you have a sense, you probably heard a lot of buzz about augmented reality, and again, this is one of those things that was, sorry, a bit science fiction-y, right? But like, it's actually coming to reality now. So the kind of things that Geordie LaForge wore are available for people just kind of walking around in the street and augmenting their experience with the world. So in addition to all those new technologies that we're experiencing and playing around with and looking for educational applications for, and there are a multitude of educational applications, we also need to be thinking about new pedagogies that these technologies are affording. And the way that I kind of been thinking about this recently is this continuum between resident and online education. We are beyond the days where students either exist within one or the other mode of learning. Students that are here on campus are often taking online courses. A lot of the resident courses that are here are doing things like flipping their classroom. They're doing blended versions of their classes. We're doing MOOCs. We're doing all sorts of lecture capture and things like that kind of blend the idea of online and resident. So if you looked at the announcement about Craig Whiteman's new position as Vice Provost of Online Learning, I think that, if you read closely, got a good indication of the sort of recognition by Penn State of that sort of blurry line where there is this sort of continuum of experiences, and we really need to look at the experiences that we provide students, the technologies that enable those experiences, and really not think of it this sort of binary mode. So interesting stuff happening there. Lots of new challenges that we're facing as well that we need to keep in mind. New players in the educational field, lots of for-profit universities, people like Coursera, who, while they appear to be great partners for people like Penn State, certainly have their eye on their own contribution to higher education, and I'm sure that at some point they're going to sort of turn into their own institution. Student debt is a problem that you probably have all heard about. Students are leaving college with an enormous amount of debt, not getting jobs, and basically having a real hard time with that debt and not being able to pay it off. And this really affects students' decisions about whether they want to come into college at all, and it really puts the onus on us to provide a really valuable experience for them and prove to them that it's worth coming and spending 4 years at Penn State. So this is a struggle not only for the students, but for us in attracting students. Low retention, this is one of those things that learning analytics kind of gets at, but there's a lot of students that are coming to college and within 2 or 3 years dropping out because of financial problems or just because of lack of relevance to what they want to do in life, or a lot of different reasons. But this is a problem that we have to tackle, and again, I think we can do that by providing really engaging experiences and really providing a lot of personalized learning to students. And a little bit on consolidation, we just met with some folks from a college in Texas that were discussing a lot of the smaller colleges in the area consolidating into a single college because financially they just can't make it. So with all that said, all the new technologies, the new pedagogies, and the new challenges that are in front of us, I think it's important to think a lot about the new connections that we're forming. And I mean that in terms of, and all these things that I just mentioned that are on our radar, we really need to be thinking in terms of how these things interrelate to each other, and how the lessons that we learn in one space can be leveraged to benefit other spaces. And I think that, in addition to these sort of connections, I think the connections between us are really essential. I think that the Tailgate is a really good example of an opportunity for us to get together, share ideas, share solutions, because the world is changing really quickly, and I don't think that we can go out and succeed by ourselves. So I really urge you to take the opportunity to talk to your colleagues today as much as possible, learn as much as you possibly can, and share. And then when you leave here, throughout the next year, continue to engage in that sort of sharing of best practices and sharing of solutions so that we can make sense of all this craziness that's happening in the world. So on the topic of connections, I thought I'd introduce our keynote speaker, Lori Hepner. Lori is an interdisciplinary artist working primarily in conceptual-based photography and photographic installations. Her most recent body of work, Status Symbols, is a series of portraits that are studies of the identity in the digital age of social media throughout. The portrait focuses on the visualizing text-based tweets and abstracted visual portraits by using the on-off signature of the computer's native language, binary code. She is a graduate of Rhode Island School of Design, earning an MFA in digital media in 2005, and received her BFA in fine art photography from Rochester Institute of Technology in 2003. Lori's work has been exhibited both nationally and internationally, including exhibitions in the international, help me pronounce that, the Ishui Photography Festival in China, Houston Center for Photography, in the 14th in the Duke University SRO Photography Gallery in Texas Tech University. Lori currently lives and works in Pittsburgh, PA, where she's Associate Professor of Integrative Arts at the Greater Allegheny campus, Penn State University. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lori Hepner.
So I guess I'm using this mic. Okay. As we get this. All right. So thanks everybody for coming today. Sort of nice to be able to present and sort of show some of my artwork, which is primarily what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll just hold this. But basically, looking at digital identity in this sort of age of social media and how we should be paying attention to how we put ourselves out there online. So I wanted to start out saying, pretty much, I love computers. I love technology. One of the things that really makes me who I am is the fact that I've had a computer my whole life. And that might not seem weird for students in this age, but for somebody that was growing up in the 80s, it was very weird to have computers. These days, we might look at it like this, or text message based. But I wanted to start out showing you my computer drawings. So when I was in kindergarten, we had computer art class. And this is kind of astounding. I don't know how this happened. It was through the Pittsburgh public school system. And as I was in graduate school, I found some of these printouts that I had made from kindergarten. And basically, so this is a turkey. It was near Thanksgiving, if we look at a turkey. But these were made using mathematical equations. This was not made in Photoshop. Photoshop didn't exist. This was made in a program called Logos. There was a turtle. And you typed in commands, and through these programming, you drew pictures. And so I didn't realize at the time how profound this was going to be and how it was really going to affect and shape my future as what I am now, which would be a digital artist. And the fact that I had this opportunity sort of as a young child was very strange. And I don't really know anybody else that had that sort of same experience, even though for students now, it's normal to have a computer. I'm sure there's 3-year-olds drawing pictures on iPads. So it's a different situation today. But we're going to kind of start by looking back before we branch out. It's always good to kind of see a little bit of where we came from. So for those of you that don't know, the first sort of delving into programming, this is a jacquard loom. And this was basically the first way to do programming. It made different patterns in fabric. And so these punch cards were the way that patterns became created. And this moves into the digital age by sort of the inspirations that this was happening. There was Babbage, who became inspired by these jacquard looms. And eventually, we get into more modern computers, but this isn't exactly modern as we know it. This is more modern in the sense of we had room-sized computers that still needed to use punch cards, like those jacquard loom cards, to make programs. And so they looked like this. And you'd have to punch this out as a computer programmer to make a program. Very different from today's way of programming using language, but really using shapes in absence of space to make a program. So the first thing I found, this is the first piece of computer art. It's a pinup girl. And what happened, I sort of came across this in an article on The Atlantic earlier in the year. And basically, there was Sage Computer Systems through MIT and I think the federal government. And this was 1956-58. And this is from the semi-automatic ground environment live radar system that was developed for the Cold War, basically to protect the country. And this was the first live graphics. So the computer programmers, something that we have to remember, were primarily men. So this was a diagnostic process to make sure the screen was working. And it's a pinup girl. So the fact that sort of digital culture stems from this, most programmers were male, and this is something that I think people don't always take into consideration, and something that's inspired me to make my own artwork is looking at sort of where did language come from, where did this idea of binary code, which has inspired most of my work, who wrote that? What's the culture like that existed within that time period? So this was another example of what the output was. So to kind of keep this in the back of your head as we sort of go forward into the more current system of things. So this is, I'm going to show you the first part of my binary code inspiration. So this is me in grad school, making binary code in an alleyway in Providence using flour in my hands. And so what was happening is this is sort of looking at a way to link live culture with coded culture. And so I'm actually spelling out the word link in binary code. So for those of you that don't know, binary code, they're zeros and they're ones. And that's the base level of how a computer can sort of understand what the programming is, the electricity pulses of on and off. And sort of by doing this, I was trying to sort of make fun of the fact that computer culture is a certain thing. So sort of, this was just left in the alleyway for a while. It's sort of the beginning and end of my performance art career. So I'm kind of pull up some new things. So as I've been making artwork and sort of been living my life as somebody obsessed with computers, I've had one forever. I've always had a Mac. And we have sort of what has evolved into artwork. And going to school for photography, originally, you're used to taking photographs of people, taking portraits of people, or taking photographs of places. And I was really interested in sort of abstract shapes, abstract ways of thinking. And binary code really fit into that. So this is a piece, sort of the first piece in a series that I call Code Words. And what you can see in the layout, there's, if you think about that fact that on and off binary code, there's imagery and there's lack of imagery. So we sort of have this pattern of binary code happening. And one of the things that sort of inspired me by thinking about the fact that binary code was really something that a bunch of computer men figured out and sort of made this system. And I was really interested in thinking about what would happen if binary code would sort of break down and mutate. What would happen if it evolved, if it was something that was a living system? And this was from about 2007, so this isn't too long ago. But what I was inspired to do was to sort of create a process. And for me, as sort of a digital artist, I like mixing analog and digital together and sort of playing around what happens when you do something that is originally analog, but then gets switched, gets converted to digital. And so this series of work, I was really experimenting with taking binary code, zeros and ones, and writing down what ended up being titles of pieces. And this is a piece that I called Exasperate Quagmire. And so looking at sort of language and poetry and the ways that we think about the world and turning that into performance piece. Whereas I realized I don't really like performing in front of people as an artist. This was sort of doing it in the studio, looking and turning words into those zeros and ones. And so I was writing on fabric the title of the piece and then dissolving it away in bleach and photographing what happened. And then turning that into both another sort of conversion of binary code in the way that the layout is. So on all these pieces, the title has like a 2-word title with a colon. The first word I've made sort of in the process of making the photographs, and the second word is sort of spelled out. On this, it's pretty easy, left to right, in zeros and ones. So if you are new to the new idea of binary code and such, there's 8 different digits of zeros and ones to make a keyboard letter in the ASCII, which is keyboard code. So, and for these, every 8 zeros and ones is a letter. And sort of spelling it out in this way, you can sort of see how much information is needed for just a few pieces of code. And so this was a different piece called Insinuate Debase. Not that you need to know all of the titles, but these exist as sort of installations. And I have sort of some close-ups to show you guys for this. And so these ideas of digital culture and sort of living, this was sort of the precursor to really the Facebook era, the MySpace era, sort of the past the MySpace era, the social media that we're really living in today. And so these were really fixed pieces. They weren't meant to happen over the course of time. They weren't really living online. But was something that, as I was getting out of graduate school, was really sort of frustrated by the way that programming and digital computers were working. It was sort of not yet up to speed enough that you had to still be an expert computer programmer to make anything that became a piece of digital artwork or something that was interactive. And so the way that I was interacting with these was, instead of doing it in the computer, I was sort of doing it as I was photographing, as I was sort of making these images that sort of talked about digital, while not actually becoming something that was interactive. I'm gonna click through a couple of these. So all of these, this is sort of an installation view. So all of these were pretty large photographic prints that ended up being, so these are about 6 total, about 6 foot wide, about 2 feet tall. This was a piece that was in the Carnegie Museum that's 13 foot tall, that was really meant to sort of overwhelm you in a way that I was also feeling sort of overwhelmed in figuring out, how do I learn programming? How do I sort of manage this digital culture into my artwork in a way that is both questioning the culture but also kind of living within it at the same time? And as I was doing this, sort of the art part of me was really looking at the imagery as drawings and sort of the way that the computer was drawing through my code as I was starting out in school, sort of using the camera to sort of capture some of that. And so what was happening in these was that the performance that was happening was basically an organic performance. So if you are a chemistry major, you may understand that organic material, in this case was silk, placing it in bleach equals that it dissolves. It also makes chlorine gas, so don't do this at home. I didn't know that originally. I learned that pretty fast, have a gas mask to make this happen. But sort of that process of that organic breaking down was something I wanted to kind of pair up with the digital process. And so a lot of my work, there's still something analog, even if it's something that's kind of hidden. But ultimately, I was interested in making contemporary artwork. I'm an artist. And so the layout of these and sort of printing them really large scale, this was a piece that's about, I think about 6 foot by 6 foot. It's called Nebula Spasm 1. And sort of being able to have these sort of exist as architecture on the wall was really interesting to me, because I didn't want something to just be screen-based. I wanted it to stay and be able to be viewed regardless of whether the electricity was working or somebody knew how to turn the piece of artwork on or off correctly. So I'll show a couple of these. And so this series I sort of finished up in 2008, 2009, and sort of decided to move on, but still keep sort of my interest in digital technology at the core of what I've been working on. I'm going to fast forward through a couple of these. So some of these haven't been made as gigantic things. Sort of the shoot-off that came next was a collaboration with a friend of mine, Justin Meyer. He's a postdoc now at Harvard in biology. And I've known him for a really long time. We've been friends since we were kids. And we sort of took a quote from his research. Mutation, the genetic fuel for progress, is usually destructive. And turned that into an artwork based on his science. I didn't see these first. This was the science. Some photographs of bacteria cultures in petri dishes. And it became very funny because my artwork kind of looks like that, even though it wasn't really planned that way. So what happened was that this was a installation in a shipping container. So it's 8 foot tall by 40 foot long. And there's 512 prints in the shipping container. So the way that this works with binary code is that on these walls, these prints spell out that quote. And people could come in and purchase a print for $20. And when they took it down, they altered what it said. So my interest in this idea of code is what happens if one of those ones and zeros goes away? What does the mutation happen? How does that sort of change the way that the code exists or performs now in computers? So these are some of the prints, similar process to the other code words pieces of these dissolving. And by placing it on these walls, people could really experience what it was looking like. And so to talk a little bit more about binary code, this is the letter system. So if you are using the keyboard, this is known as ASCII, A-S-C-I-I, if you didn't know that, not sort of another way of pronouncing it. These zeros and ones spell out these letters. So if you change just one of the digits, it really changes what it says. So this is the first, I think, 12 or 16 mutations from when people took prints away. And so the first one, you can sort of see mutation, the genetic fuel for progress is usually destructive. And in the second, it gets mutation, the genetic fuel for progress, gobbledygook you can't understand. So basically, that one deletion of one character turned this into just gibberish. And that was something that was really interesting to me because, what if you're on the internet and your connection isn't so clear? What happens when part of that goes away? And here you can see quite clearly it very quickly dissolves from language into something that none of us can understand. All right. Fast forwarding a little bit quickly. So from there, sort of moving into my next body of work. And this is something that sort of popped into my head fully formed as an art idea, which rarely happens. But I was taking a class on soldering and electronics through a group in Pittsburgh called Hack Pittsburgh, not a hacker culture in a bad way. And I sort of had this flash of imagination. What happens if I use LEDs to draw with? And what I decided to do was to make something like this. This is my little test piece, where tweets would get converted into portraits. And that's this is the first one. So in 2009, this started, the status symbols is the body of work. And I was working with the Brooklyn Museum, and they then had a @FirstFans Twitter account that was where they would give artists the account for a month to make artwork on Twitter. The tweets were the artwork. And so I was able to do this in December of 2009. And what I was doing is tweeting to the followers of this account and asking them to talk about their digital identity and to think about how their identity lives in the digital age. And so this was the first tweet I got back from Ranjit on December 2nd, and it was just, "Arr," like a pirate. And I didn't really know that it was going to make an image that I thought was really beautiful. I didn't know what was going to happen. So what we're really looking at is a long exposure photograph of these. And so the LEDs are blinking out in binary code each letter of the tweet. And for these ones, I didn't use this particular LED device, but it was something that I built. And it would be rotating. So using long exposure photography, and this is where the analog part comes, on film, doing long exposures of tweets. And so this was the first one that came out, and I was really happily shocked that it sort of was better than I was anticipating. So the piece, this was sort of its sister piece. I was doing sort of, this is right after the code words, and I was really interested in that idea of dual binary on and offs. So I was doing both sort of diffused images and then more in focus images, which is kind of evolved as it then went on. And so these were some of the portraits. Ultimately, in that month, I did 52 different portraits of people that would tweet. So they would tweet to me, I would go and turn it into a computer program, which then got photographed via the LEDs. And then I'd have to basically take it to a photo lab. We had one photo lab left in Pittsburgh that developed film. I didn't know that a month and a half later they went out of business. So if I had done this later, it would be much more problematic. So I would go to the lab, try to get the film process very quickly. And these is medium format film, so it's pretty large scale. Bring it back, scan it, Photoshop it enough that I have an image, and then tweet it back. So the participants got to see their portraits as images as the month went on. So through that month, there were 52 different portraits that were tweeted back. And the bad part about this project was that about a year after this occurred, the Brooklyn Museum decided that they were going to stop the program, which for the artists, we were kind of really saddened by this. And so this is where the idea of digital identity, these tweets were the art. And the Brooklyn Museum ultimately decided they were deleting the account, which really felt like they were deleting somebody's identity. And so it was something that with the artists, we had this crazy email chain going back and forth between us and the museum saying, please don't, just archive it, just stop tweeting if you don't want the program to go on. Let this identity exist. And they decided they'd delete it anyway. So it was really sad. And so now they do have a blog post that they have that you can look and sort of see what people have tweeted, but it's not the same. So this idea of sort of Twitter as identity was something that sort of has stuck with me. So the project has evolved. And also evolved into a sculpture. So this is just a still shot of the sculpture. And so you can sort of see, you can play this, you can sort of see what it looks like as I talk. And so from that at First Fans, it got changed into this interactive piece of sculpture. And what was happening, this was searching via Wi-Fi, a Twitter search for status with a hashtag. And when that status hashtag was found, it was converting it into LEDs. This is happening at a slower rate because it's something you could sort of see in person. But this was at a light art event in Richmond called InLight Richmond. And it was a live light art in the evening it's early November every year. And so people would come and they'd tweet their portraits to the sculpture. And it would update every 2 minutes. And so when you're standing there, if you're in the dark, your eyes start to get that persistence of vision and you start to sort of see these blur together, which is how I was doing it in the photograph versions of these. So that's sort of the nicer version as my little handheld version of the status symbols. So this was a few years later. I'm going to let this play in the background. That I continued to do the status symbols project and decided to only go with this diffused version to not confuse people that were not obsessed with binary code like I am, and we're just sort of looking at this as imagery. So all of these is really when I got into the idea of interest as digital identity online. How does our digital identity affect how people see us? How is digital identity happening for others that are tweeting? So these are taken from the top 10 Twitterers, looked at number of followers. And so I was really looking at society, looking at digital identity. So some of these, this one is President Obama, and these were tweets that were happening at the time. This is from 2011. And so each of these was sort of seeing how people were performing their digital identity online. Was it a direct quote, or was there a staffer that wrote that? And through these, it became really, the thing that I was most interested in is how people were performing their identity online. And what do you put on Twitter? What do you put out there that exists? Do you think about that? This is Britney Spears. So a lot of these, you can tell that they're kind of random. She probably did write that. There probably wasn't a staffer. And there's some other ones that are pretty interesting that pop up. But this is, I believe, a tweet about Microsoft buying Skype. So how is that identity for a corporation? I think a future one is Martha Stewart. How does she really, perform her identity online? And the idea of, tweets as identity is something I don't think a lot of people are thinking about. Same thing as Facebook posts. You know, that's out there representing you as a person. And sort of as we move into the age where we're now finding out that we're being, you know, surveillance on ourselves in social media networks, it becomes a little bit a strange thing that I think we all need to think about more deeply than just sort of, you know, are the things that we're writing, do we care if they're, you know, grammatically correct? Or do we care about what they sound like and they look like? So all of these were happening. There's one I think in particular I wanted to show. And sometimes they're just something like a link. But in terms of the artwork, the way that this was sort of turning into colors, that the thing that I could change with this was how did I convert the tweet into a picture? And so one of the ways is with hashtags. As we know, that's one way to sort of mark our tweets. If everybody here is interested in technology, I know you probably all know what hashtags are. But having that hashtag, I made sure that those would come up as red. Sort of, these were something that people wanted to demarcate as important. I could also do @ symbols, so somebody's name would come up as a different color. I think in these it was orange. Like this is primarily a hashtag and an @ symbol. And this was one of the first few that came up, and I was really shocked with what it looks like. And so this was Rihanna, or this was Katy Perry tweeting to Rihanna to work. And so another thing I got really interested in is how people were using language, how it was changing, how sort of new spellings of things, new slang was popping up online, and how did we think about that? Do people, you know, really go around telling people to work it in the way that they do on Twitter? And what happens when those words start to enter culture as well? And so the idea of what the digital identity is, for me, the visuals, I think, kind of mirror it as well, because what ends up happening is that the way these are made, they're not data visualizations like you would think of for big data. You can't go back and get to the tweet. So the fact that these are long exposure photographs, the moving LEDs overlap each other, so you can never actually go backwards, which was done purposefully. I wanted these to sort of stand as fingerprints of the tweets, something that you couldn't necessarily replicate exactly. And the colors also, each word, every time there was a space, it would randomly pick a color. So it's not something that I was completely deciding, but sort of the code was deciding. And that was something as well that was really interesting to me in terms of how that kind of fits with things. So I'm going to let these play in the background. So the next body of work that I was proposing to do, which ended up not being something that I actually turned into artwork that's a physical thing. So about a year ago, I was coming up with what I wanted to do after this, what was an idea that I had. And what I thought would be most interesting is how do we think about how are we being surveilled on the internet? And so my proposal of this project was finding a way to sort of track cookies and track where we're being tracked online. And ultimately, one of the, I guess, idealistic goals was, oh, it would be really interesting if I could actually collaborate with real hackers and make artwork. Well, I was up for tenure, so I wasn't going to collaborate with hackers because I didn't want to get fired. So I didn't actually fulfill the project idea. So it sort of exists as a proposal. And this was done sort of about last spring. Fast forward a year, and we find out that we are being tracked online. The NSA, the Edward Snowden leaks that came out that's saying that, you know, our wireless data, the ways that we interact online, our emails are being tracked by the government. And they still don't really want to admit this. But so that was my inspiration for that project that I didn't do, then to find out that that's really what's happening to me. And so as we continue to live this digital culture and have digital identity online, we have to think about, you know, what do we want to put out there and how are we being tracked? And so I really would like to do a real project by, you know, being able to either collaborate with hackers or, you know, even just collaborating with the way that our web data is being sort of putting cookies in different places. And for me, the turning it into artwork part is the, you know, bringing a little bit of awareness to the issue, while also making something that's aesthetically interesting. So for me, I don't want to just do conceptual work, but I also don't want to just make pretty things. So it's sort of the way that I think about my artwork is the way to mix those two things together. And sort of as I sort of go into the future of making additional digital artworks, the idea of social media identity is really what I'm going to be focusing on. and continuing to use Twitter, but then also going into how do Vines work? How does that sort of, if you have short videos of yourself online, how does that stay on the internet? How does that sort of change your digital identity? And so the next project is hopefully to do some additional sort of, social media portraits using tweets and other social media posts, and then actually taking them out into the landscape and sort of painting the landscape with some of these LED devices that I'm building to kind of place tweets into an actual space that's sort of a physical space to be seen. And so that's hopefully the next thing. And I think this is also a good place that I can sort of sum up the ending. So this is one of my favorite pieces. This is from Lady Gaga. And I have no idea what that says. And so the funny thing is that as I was pulling these tweets from Twitter, this is the next one. The image is a little bit different in terms of what it looks like. This is also a Lady Gaga tweet. So this was her next tweet. And the fact that it sort of resulted from that really gibberish random tweet, so that was Lady Gaga's butt tweet. And I think that the fact that that was something that was posted online is both hilarious in terms of how culture is working, but also I think a really nice point to end the day on. So thank you for listening. Please come talk to me at some point later if you have any questions.